Noel arrived back at the shooting studio at noon the next day. Even though it was Sunday and he generally spent his Sundays watching sports on TV or playing intramural ball with his frat brothers, he figured he should get to the studio on time to mend things with Sam. Even though Sam hadn't said much, he was clearly pretty upset the day before. Noel might have pushed that a little too far. He knew he sometimes did it. When Noel discovered Sam wasn't in the studio yet, he stretched out on the bed to wait. 45 minutes later, he was still lying there. He closed his eyes and must have fallen asleep, because when Amber charged in the room, he was so startled he almost fell out of the bed. "Did you hear?" "Huh?" He sat up. "Hear what?" He rubbed his face. "What time is it?" "It's 2:30. The news about Sam." "What news about Sam?" Amber hugged herself. "They think he might have been hit by a train." She brushed at her puffy eyes. "What?" "Apparently he made a costume for your movie, one with black feathers, and they found feathers all over the tracks for like 2 miles. All over the place." Noel shot off the bed. "Is he okay?" Amber shook her head. "Well, that's the thing. They don't know. He's missing." "I've got to go." Noel charged past Amber and tore out of the film studios building. The railroad tracks ran along the backside of the campus behind the cafeteria, rec center, and swimming pool complex. They were about a half mile from the film studies building, jogging past kids throwing frisbee in the quad and others studying in the shade of the campus's big cedar trees. Noel ignored several greetings and concentrated on getting to the tracks. Hit by a train? Missing? Noel couldn't believe it. When Noel reached the tracks, his stomach clenched at the sight of a half-dozen cop cars pulled up alongside the tracks and double that number of cops walking the area, their gazes to the ground. Pushing into the relatively docile crowd hanging out behind crime scene tape, guarded by a large balding cop, Noel approached the cop and said, "Hey, I'm Sam's friend. Have you found him yet?" "Who are you?" the cop asked. "Sam's friend," Noel repeated. "Noel Markham." Noel saw no reason to keep his name a secret. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? "You know something about what happened here?" the cop asked. "I only know what a friend told me, that because of the feathers, you think Sam was hit by a train and you can't find him." The cop eyed him. Could the guy have been more of a cliche? Big gut, shiny head surrounded by a black fringe of hair, dark eyes squinted to try and intimidate Noel, thick hands resting on his gun belt? The cop could have walked off a TV set. Except this cop smelled like hair gel and cheap cologne. At least TV cops were unscented. Noel eyed the cop right back. "If you don't have something to tell us," the cop said, toying with his nightstick, "get back there with everyone else." Noel didn't move. He leaned to his right to see past the cop. Even from here, he could see black feathers fluttering over the tracks. The cop shifted his stance, and that's when Noel noticed the tall couple standing between one of the police cars and a bright red Chevy Suburban. They were talking with a big guy in a baggy suit. Noel bit the inside of his cheek so he wouldn't groan out loud. Those were Sam's parents, Paul and Molly O'Neill. He met them when they threw a party to celebrate the previous semester's completed film projects. Really nice people. Both were tall and dark like Sam, although Sam's mom wasn't as tall. She was almost as tall as Noel, though. Hefty, too. If there was something called Mom League in the NFL, she could have played. "Call me Molly," she'd said when Noel had met her. "Miss O'Neill is my mother-in-law." Noel remembered Molly had a great smile and an even better laugh. Right now, she wasn't laughing, she was crying, her head pressed against her husband's shoulder. Noel clenched his fist in frustration. How could he help? Molly looked up and spotted Noel. "Noel? Is that you?" The cop standing with Sam's parents motioned for the TV cop to let Noel pass. Noel couldn't stop himself from giving the cop a smirk as he went past, but his smirk died a quick death when he saw Molly's pinched white face. She rushed to Noel and threw her arms around him. "You heard? Oh, Noel, he's missing. They say he probably couldn't have survived." Her voice broke, and she turned back towards Paul. Paul held Molly with one arm and offered his other hand for Noel to shake. Holding Molly close, Paul said, "Because of the way the feathers of his costume were scattered, they think he was probably grazed by the train and then thrown clear, but they hadn't found him." Noel frowned and watched a black feather scuttle over the ground near the rails. That's when he noticed blood on the rail, on the opposite side of the tracks. Not a lot of blood, just one smear, but it was a big smear. A police officer taking pictures of it. Blood, Noel thought. There had to be blood, he kept telling Sam. Noel lingered by the tracks with Sam's distraught parents the rest of the afternoon. By then the police had declared Sam missing, presumed dead. Multiple search parties had been sent out. Noel had even been part of one, but no one found anything. When Noel left the tracks to return to his room, he let Molly and Paul hug him, even though he didn't want to be hugged. Being near them was like standing next to a loudspeaker for emotions. Their grief was amplified by their facial expressions and memories about Sam. The clamorous sense of loss was more than Noel could handle. He couldn't stand to be around Molly and the cops anymore. He had to get away. Once Noel started walking away from the scene at the tracks, he couldn't stop. He just couldn't process what had happened. How could Sam be dead? Was it my fault? What? Why do you think that? He didn't do anything. But that isn't true, is it? He kinda did do something. He'd been a bit of a jackass the day before, and Sam had been upset. He tried to hide it, but Noel could tell Sam was pissed when he left the studio. So what if being upset had made him careless? But it happened this morning, not last night, he told himself. Sam wouldn't have been still upset this morning, would he? Noel wasn't convincing himself. Oh, why did he have to be such a dick sometimes? Yo, Noel, so go along. Noel looked up to see one of his intramural buddies holding a football and pointing. Noel dutifully trotted in the direction indicated and caught a somewhat wobbly spiral after juggling it a couple of times. He was about to throw it back, intended to return it in an upstaging perfect spiral, but his gaze, as he brought his arm forward, landed on a large black shape just at the edge of the trees. Noel let go of the ball, and it flopped all over the place before landing 50 feet short of its target. Wuss! Noel's friend called. Noel ignored him. What had he just seen? Noel continued to ignore his friend, who was now shouting denigrating comments about Noel's throwing ability. Noel hadn't seen what he'd thought he'd seen, had he? When Noel reached the trees, he looked up into the sagging branches and then down into the tangled underbrush. He saw nothing out of the ordinary. It must have been his imagination. All that talk of black feathers and Sam's costume was messing with his head. A little after 6, Noble's stomach came unclenched enough to remind him he hadn't eaten since before he'd gone to the shooting studio. He needed food. A little after 6, Noel's stomach came unclenched enough to remind him that he hadn't eaten since before he'd gone to the shooting studio, and he needed food. So he headed to the cafeteria. Not much of what he was served there could be called food, but he was hungry enough to eat pretty much anything at this point. The cafeteria was only half full, as was usual on Sundays. A lot of students went away for the weekends, and even more ate out. Usually only the nerds were around about now. Hey. Noel didn't have to turn to identify the speaker. It was Amber. He wasn't sure what to say to her. Their last exchange felt like years ago. She must have come looking for an update about Sam. Noel turned. Hey, I, never see you here on Sundays. Noel let out a sigh of relief at the slight hint of sarcasm she managed to slide into pretty much everything that came out of her mouth, even when sarcasm wasn't required. He wasn't sure he could talk about Sam right now. That's because I'm never here on Sundays. So you're not here now? Obviously. Amber rolled her eyes. So is your clone going to get in line, or just stand there getting in the way? Noel couldn't help himself. He grinned. He'll get in line, just so he doesn't put you out. Nice of him. He's actually a pretty nice guy. Noel stepped back and motioned for Amber to go ahead of him. He should give you lessons. Amber winked at Noel as she passed him. Noel followed Amber through the line, grabbing some of this and some of that. He had no idea what he was putting on his tray. He was already distracted by what had happened to Sam, plus he was trying to puzzle out what he'd seen by the trees, and now Amber was befuddling him. He'd only recently figured out he might like her, and they'd gone out on their first date the night before. It had been good, but today has kind of wiped the date from his mind. Should I have called her by now? It would have been nice, Amber said. What? You just said, should I have called her by now? I did? You did. She gave him a sideways glance. There had to be evidence of his whacked-out mental state. Noel decided maybe he should stop thinking completely. Finding himself at a big round table covered in crumbs and smeared with something red, Noel sat down. He stared at the red smear. Surely not blood. It must have been ketchup. Why did he have blood on the brain? Noel glanced at Amber to be sure he hadn't said that out loud. Apparently not. She was putting blue cheese dressing on a big salad. The cafeteria was about a third full. Conversations were muted, and silverware/dish face-offs were intermittent. Outside the wall-to-wall windows, the quad was emptying. The sun was dipping behind the tops of the trees where Noel thought he'd seen... Nothing. I saw nothing, he told himself. Noel looked at his tray. He blinked. Somehow he'd managed to get sauerkraut, beets, mashed potatoes, 3 dinner rolls without butter, 2 dill pickles, and 3 kinds of pie. Are you pregnant? Amber was eyeing his tray, too. Apparently. Noel picked up a spoon, realizing he hadn't gotten a fork. He dug into the mashed potatoes as if all was right in the world. he noticed that the cafeteria smelled like beef stew. Was that the entree he'd missed? Amber chewed and then put down her fork. I'm sorry about earlier. For once, her words were free of sarcasm. Earlier? When I told you about Sam, I shouldn't have dropped it on you the way I did. Noel grabbed his glass and took a drink of what was in it to wash down the gluey mashed potatoes. He discovered he'd gotten sweet iced tea. He hated iced tea. It's okay. Amber put her hand on Noel's arm. No, it's not. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you two were so close. Noel shot a look at her. Was she being sarcastic again? No, judging from the little crimp between her brows, she was concerned. We're not that, Noel began. Then he realized that, yeah, he was pretty close to Sam. They'd started out as a complete mismatch assigned to work with each other. Noel was rushing his fraternity, Sam lived with his parents. Noel was cool. Sam seemed to go out of his way not to be cool. So screamed his almost military haircut, his crispy iron shirt thanks to Molly, and that legal briefcase he usually carried around instead of a backpack. You're not? Amber asked. Noel shook his head. Yeah, I guess we've kind of gotten sort of close. He's kind of a strange dude, but he's smart and he's funny. He's a nice guy. Like you, Amber said. Noel frowned at her. He stood up so abruptly his knee hit the table and all the dishes rattled on the trays. His tea sloshed. I've got to go. Amber looked at him. It's like deja vu. Huh? She waved him away. Oh, call me when you find your brain. Okay. Noel strode away from the table and dumped his tray in the return area. The uneaten food earned him a stern glance from one of the round women with the hairnets who worked in the cafeteria. He didn't care. He just had to... What was that? Noel stopped just outside the doors of the cafeteria and stared down the hall. He looked the other way too, and when he turned back to look behind him, he rubbed his eyes and checked that area again. Nothing out of the ordinary. Dirty beige floor, pale yellow walls, posters vying for space on an overcrowded bulletin board that ran along the wall. A few students strolling in and out of the cafeteria. Nothing to see here, folks. Yeah, so why was Noel sure he just spotted something big and black flutter around the corner at the end of the hall? And what was that noise? Noel tilted his head and listened. It sounded like rhythmic rustling, a sort of whispery sound like, well, like wet feathers being dragged along the floor. Noel trotted out of the cafeteria building, stopped, bent over, and took a couple big breaths of fresh air outside. You okay? No? Noel looked up. One of his frat brothers, Steve, stood at the bottom of the stairs, his arm draped over a pretty red-headed girl. Yeah, I'm fine. You say so, Steve said. Noel lifted a hand and Steve and the girl wandered off. Noel headed for the frat house. Noel sat on his bed, legs spread out and his hands loosely in his lap. He rolled his head around, listening to his neck crack, and he took several deep breaths. When you're tense, adopt a relaxed posture. Loosen your muscles and breathe deeply, his mother taught him when he was little and was really worked up about something. Tell your body how you feel, and it will come along for the ride. Usually that worked pretty well, but not this time, and for good reason. The situation was a little beyond old-school relaxation techniques. Between leaving the cafeteria and getting into this room, Noel had seen something, not someone, but something following him 4 times. 4 times Sam had heard that weird sound, a cross between the sound of the wind and a fluttering noise combined with regularly spaced airy thumps. No matter how many times he tried to tell himself he was hearing some kind of mechanical contraption or some sort of air conditioning or fan unit attached to one of the buildings on campus, he couldn't convince himself of the lie. The truth was that he wasn't hearing the sound of feathers. Lots of them, brushing over the ground and grazing the edges of the trees and buildings. It might have been easier to believe his lies about the sound if he hadn't also seen a mammoth lurching swell of feathers rippling just at the edge of his peripheral vision. 4 times he'd seen these sinister forms billowing in and out between the trees and the buildings. Well, seen was a bit of an overstatement. He actually wasn't sure about what his eyes had told him. The word seen implied a direct vision of something. Noel hadn't had that. He had this idea of seeing something, but the more he kicked around this idea, the more he became convinced he had seen something. Something had toyed with his senses, something just beyond the reach of confident visual certainty. Something had been massive, black, and feathery. And there it was again. A large shape darkened Noel's small west-facing window, blotting out the sinking sun for just an instant. Noel only caught it out of the corner of his eye again, but it was there. Noel bent over and put his head in his hands. Oh man, oh man, oh man. He straightened up. Get a grip, he ordered himself. Taking a deep breath, he looked around his room. Noel might have looked just sloppy enough to be cool, but he liked order in his surroundings. He was a minimalist. His room was soothingly white. The maple furniture had clean lines, though it was lightly stained. The small fridge he used for bottled water and the occasional leftover pizza, if he left it in the main kitchen it was sure to get stolen, was white with sleek lines. The bed was made, if a bit messily, and covered with a plain tan comforter. The rug under the bed was sisal. The floor and all furniture surfaces were clutter-free. The only things on his walls were a few black and white still shots from old movies. Noel's frat brothers kept trying to get him to hang the frat's Greek letters over his room. Noel said he didn't need them to know what frat he was in. That refusal was just one of the many that had earned him the nickname No. The black shape passed his window again. Noel ran to the window and pulled the white room-darkening shade. A shadow flitted behind the shade, and Noel turned his back on the window. This is just stupid. He crossed to the bed and sat again. Was it? Noel liked to think he was a pretty reasonable guy, but he knew what was going on here, and it wasn't reasonable at all. It was very unreasonable. It was unreasonable, but he was sure it was true. Noel was seeing Sam in the Blackbird costume, and Sam was stalking Noel. Why was Sam stalking Noel? Well, it was obvious, wasn't it? Sam was stalking Noel because he was now the Blackbird, and the Blackbird tortured those who confessed their dirty secrets. So first Sam was going to toy with Noel the same way a bully toyed with his victim, and then Sam was going to kill Noel for being such a horrible person. Noel was sure about it, and the worst part was that Noel deserved it. Sunday nights in the frat house were movie nights, and normally Noel didn't miss that, not just because he helped organize the events, but because he enjoyed them. But tonight's movie was a horror flick, with blood, and Noel wasn't up for it. He begged off, earning himself a shower of popcorn and a chorus of boos and hisses. After a half hour of trying to study and another half hour of staring at the ceiling, Noel wished he had joined in movie night, but he didn't want to go down now. He was too edgy. Noel's phone rang, and he snatched it up, hoping it was news about Sam. Sam's all right. He is, he thought before he said, hello? He is? It was Amber. Who is? You said he is, Amber said. He did it again? He really needed to stop saying his thoughts out loud. Wasn't I supposed to call you? Noel asked. You didn't. I know, jerk. Noel's heart tried to strangle him. He swallowed to push it back into place. Well, maybe I had a reason, he said. I'm listening. My friend had turned into a big blackbird, and he's going to come and kill me, Noel thought. Then he gritted his teeth, waiting for Amber to tell him he'd said it out loud. Are you going for the obscene phone call technique? She asked. What? You're breathing heavily in my ear. It's not turning me on. Are you sure? Maybe there's a delayed reaction. Amber laughed. I'll let you know. Noel grinned. In spite of how shaken he was, talking to Amber put him a little more at ease. I called because you seemed kind of freaked at the calf, Amber said. I was just... Well, just what? Is it about Sam? Noel gripped the phone so hard his fingers hurt. Yeah. Amber's voice softened. I'm sorry. Thanks. For a few moments, they were both silent. Maybe you'll find it in your sleep, Amber said. Find what? Your brain. Noel grinned again. I'll give it a go and let you know what happens. Be sure you do. When Noel hung up on the phone, he tried to convince himself that his thoughts about Sam were just some kind of craziness caused by shock. Maybe Amber was right. Maybe he could go to sleep and find his brain. The sane version of his brain. The one that wasn't being stalked by a friend in a bird suit. It was worth a try. Noel stood and stripped out of his clothes. Like the body-proud Ian, Noel slept in his underwear, and he wore boxer briefs. White. No rubber ducks. Sliding in under wrinkled sheets that desperately needed a trip to the laundry, Noel took one last look around his room to be sure all was as it should be. It was. He closed his eyes. At first, sleep wouldn't come. Noel's muscles wouldn't let go. They were so taut they could have been strung on a guitar and plucked, and if they'd been plucked, Noel was sure they'd sound dissonant. There was no question he was out of tune. Noel tried closing his eyes. Sleep began to take him, and as soon as it did, images of implausibly large, huge wings scraped against his lids. Then he felt gigantic feathers battering against his entire body. He was being pummeled by stiff, elbow-length feathers. He could feel them drub against his skin in an eerie contrast of soft versus hard. How could something as light as a feather beat him with such power and force? Fear pushed sleep from his consciousness. His eyes shot open. Flailing for the switch in his nightstand lamp, Noel listened to the thundering pace of his heart. Okay, that was alarming. Was that a dream? No, it couldn't have just been a dream because Noel had never fallen asleep. He just started falling asleep. Noel stood up, got a bottle of water from his fridge. Downing half of it, he sat on the edge of the bed and steadied his breathing. It took several minutes, and he tried not to notice his hand was shaking when he took another sip of water. Noel set down the water bottle, then said, "Get a grip." He lay down once more. "Let's try this again," Noel said to the room. He reached over and turned off the light. He closed his eyes, and someone or something opened the door to his room. Noel catapulted from the bed and knocked over his lamp, trying to turn it on. The bulb hit the wood floor and broke, so Noel ran across the room and flipped the wall switch. He was alone. The door to his room was closed, and it was locked. Noel stared at his door. What had just happened? Noel looked around. In spite of how ordinary it looked, his room was suddenly threatening. He needed a weapon. Keeping one eye at the door, Noel crossed to his closet and picked up his aluminum softball bat. Holding it like a club, he sidestepped to the door. He got a tighter grip on the bat, then unlocked the door and threw it open. The hallway was empty. Ominous music wafted up from the first floor, lots of bass and percussion. Noel looked at his watch. The movie was probably still going. Noel backed into his room and closed the door. Locking it, he leaned against it and ran a hand through his hair. Oh, what was going on with him? He looked at his bed, then he stared at the doorknob. No way he was going to sleep unless he secured his door better. Feeling a little like the idiot Sam used to say he was, Noel stepped over to his desk, grabbed his chair, and wedged the top of the back under the doorknob. Good thing he'd opted for a wooden chair instead of the plush one on wheels his mother thought he should get. Once the chair was in place, Noel looked at the shade over the window. The window was locked, right? Still clutching his softball bat, Noel checked the window. Yes, it was locked. Good. Now, can you stop acting like a paranoid mental patient? He asked himself. He didn't answer himself because he had no idea if he could stop. It didn't seem to be in his control. Noel stood in the middle of his room for several more minutes. Then he decided there was no way he was going to sleep. So he righted his lamp and went into his closet for a broom, a dustpan, and a new bulb. After he cleaned up the broken bulb and put a new one onto the lamp, he grabbed his laptop and got in bed with it. He might as well work on the new screenplay he was writing. He'd hoped it would be the script he and Sam would use for the midterm project. Now? Noel shrugged. Who knew what would become of it? But working on it might take his mind off his insanity, or make him sleepy. Whichever came first would be fine with him. It only took an hour for Noel to start nodding off. Encouraged by the silence, not just in his room, but in the frat house as a whole, Noel set aside his laptop, made sure his baseball bat was leaning handily against the side of his bed, and switched off his lamp. He immediately switched it back on. Was that a shadow he saw right as the light was going out? He scanned the room. Nothing, of course. Noel decided he needed a flashlight. His lamp might not survive the night if he kept lunging for it. Opening his nightstand drawer, Noel got out a flashlight he kept there for power outages. It was amazing how often one of his frat brothers overloaded the circuits and blew the breaker. Setting the flashlight on the nightstand, Noel looked around one more time and then gingerly laid his head on his pillow. He remained there a few minutes, about as relaxed as the wooden Indian he'd accused Sam of being. And that thought made him stiffen even more. His lungs seemed to have shrunk. They couldn't take in enough air. He tried to blank out his mind. Think of good things, his mom had always said when he was little and he'd get upset. Then she'd sing that song she always sang when he needed cheering up. He never had the heart to tell her the song didn't do it for him. He wasn't that fond of rainbows or kittens. But he did like Amber. He'd think about Amber. Amber had freckles, just a few of them, and they crossed the bridge of her nose like bird tracks. Noel stiffened again. Ixnay on the Erds, Bay, Noel told himself. He tried again. So Amber had these freckles, and she had a matching trail of them across the top of her chest. He noticed them peeking out over her neckline of the white tank shirts Amber liked to wear. He also liked that about her. She stuck with jeans and white shirts. He'd never met a girl as unconcerned with fashion as she was, but she still managed to look great. Maybe it was the wild, shoulder-length, wavy blonde hair. Noel's eyelids started to droop. Trying not to hold his breath, he reached out and turned off his lamp. He lay still and listened. Nothing. Good. Noel closed his eyes, and the window swept open. Something hit the floor with a thud. Noel grabbed for his flashlight, and he ended up knocking it across the room. He heard it clatter against the far wall. Noel seized his bat in the dark with his right hand and felt, with his trembling left hand, for the light. He managed to turn it on without breaking the bulb. The light flooded the room and revealed nothing. "What the hell?" Noel yelled. He was sure he'd heard the window open. He knew he'd heard something hit the floor. Did he dream it? He shook his head. No way. It sounded too real. Crossing to the window, Noel checked the lock again. It was latched. Okay, fine. He'd sleep with the light on. Didn't he tell Ian he should sleep through pretty much anything? And he could. So he would. Noel retrieved his flashlight and set it on the nightstand. He repositioned his bat and he lay down in the bed again. He looked at his watch. It was only 11:25. Could he call Amber? And say what? Want to come over and listen for invisible intruders with me? There was a line he never tried before. Noel threw his forearm over his eyes, but kept his eyes open. Oh, why did he push Sam so hard yesterday? Noel rolled over and punched the pillow. Is this really the time for psychoanalysis, he asked himself. He knew he shouldn't have taken that psychology class this semester. He did it because his advisor said psychology was helpful for all writers and filmmakers. He hadn't been prepared for how much it forced him to examine his own actions and motives. But he didn't want to close his eyes yet. Why not ask the hard questions? He'd known Sam was getting pissed off yesterday, but he kept needling him. Why? And even more important, why had he enjoyed bullying Christine so much in junior high? What was it about her that brought out that level of cruelty? Because there was no doubt about it. He'd been cruel, both in junior high and the day before. Where did he get that from? Did it make him feel better about himself? He tried to remember something used from his Psych 201 lectures. Was it mirroring? No, that was when you acted like someone else. Was it projecting? No, wasn't that putting your feelings off on someone else? Displacement? Getting closer.